Welcome to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Heath Carter. Heath recently published a book called Union Made, Working People and the Rise of Social Christianity in Chicago, put out by Oxford Press. Heath teaches at Valparaiso University. Heath, your book was read recently by Jackson Lears, author of Rebirth of a Nation, and Lears said, reading it reminds us of what we have lost. Tell me what we've lost.
Yeah, it's a great question. The book is about the late 19th century, which historians like to call the Gilded Age.
Yes.
And if you've heard or
Mark
read...
Mark Twain's term.
Yeah, exactly, Mark Twain's term. Some economists are calling our time a new Gilded Age. And they would point to the growing sort of inequality in our society. The gap between rich and poor is approaching historic proportions. In fact, proportions that we saw during the Great Depression era, and then before that, during this late 19th century period. Yeah. But in the book, I argue that, this use of the term a new Gilded Age is a little fast and loose, in the sense that the period that my book is about, this first Gilded Age, not only did it have massive inequality, but it also was kind of host to a lively conversation among Americans of all different kinds, Christians of all different kinds, about the morality of capitalism. And in some ways, I think that's what we've lost. We're back to the kind of large-scale inequalities of the past, but we haven't quite figured out how to have this lively, robust conversation about the economic inequality as a moral issue.
And you're really particularly interested in how Catholics and Protestants in America address this issue, right? One of the terms you use is social gospel and social Christianity. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, social Christianity is this vein of faith in American life that said, Christianity, the gospel, is not just about me and my soul or my salvation, but it also has something to say to society. That it's not just about my salvation, but about the salvation of the whole. And many people have written about the social gospel movement in American life, and oftentimes have written about it in terms of the famous ministers or seminary professors who wrote these treatises arguing that Christianity was relevant to the nation's industrial crisis. And my book's really looking at these ordinary people, blacksmiths and seamstresses and teamsters and the like, who didn't have these highfalutin seminary degrees, but who had a lot of intuitions and beliefs that Jesus was a carpenter and God is on the side of the working people.
So this period just after 1900, I guess the Gilded Age is sort of over by 1900, right? But that whole period there, up through the Great Depression, really, we see the rise of labor movements in the U.S., right? So just for those of us that aren't as familiar with this, what's the relationship, late 1800s, early 1900s, what's the relationship between organized religion in this country and the labor movements? What's the connection?
It's a great question. So, when the labor movement first gets really going in the years following the Civil War, the churches are quite nervous about it. Protestant churches in particular are notoriously hostile to the labor movement, and that's especially the case and increasingly the case as the century winds down and as the working classes become increasingly foreign-born. Protestants
and increasingly Catholic.
Increasingly Catholic, increasingly foreign-born, that's right. The Catholic Church is...
Can we just stay with that
for
a minute? So there's an older tradition in this country, right?
Yeah.
And, that I remember from high school maybe of Calvinism and things like that, in this sense that the rewards that we have in this life are given to us by God because we led good lives. And, and I recall, you know, the implication being that if you weren't rewarded, then you didn't deserve it. And can you spell that out a little bit for us here?
Yeah, that's right. So one of the thoughts that a lot of leading Protestants had in the United States in the late 19th century was, in fact, a very famous Chicago minister by the name of David Swing, who's best known because he gets caught up in a heresy trial in the Presbyterian Church. But he believed, and he spoke for many Protestant leaders when he said, you know, we don't have a conflict between capital and labor in this country. It's a battle between successful and unsuccessful lives. And he was part of a larger tradition of Protestant thought, just couldn't imagine that economic life might have built into it kind of tensions and conflict. But instead he had this vision of, you know, look, if you work hard, if you try hard, you're going to be rewarded. And thrift and sobriety and all these traits are, in this longer kind of Calvinist tradition, seen as, you know, if you act this way, you're going to succeed. And working people are challenging that and saying, look, we're working hard and we're not making it. So Swing and others, I think, are not quite, they don't quite have their finger on the pulse of a rapidly changing national economy that's going from a, you know, kind of economy of entrepreneurs and small-time artisans in the pre-Civil War era to a corporate, large-scale industrial economy in the wake of the Civil War.
Now, is there a different reaction at this time from the Catholic Church and Catholic writers?
So Catholics are, you know, leading Catholics tend to be rhetorically much friendlier to labor. They're going to say, we are the church, we support the working men of this country, we believe in what they're doing. The Pope in 1891 promulgates this very important encyclical called Rerum Novarum, which, you know, endorses labor and says, you know, labor has a place in the United States and around the industrializing world. But in the United States, Catholics are also at the same time very nervous about labor because they're nervous about disorder. They're trying to find, the Catholic Church is trying to find its place in the United States. And, you know, as you said, I mean, there's a lot of anti-Catholicism floating around in the ether. And so the church is very nervous about being associated in the minds of...
This is a period when the Ku Klux Klan is on the rise, and they were, to some extent, anti-Catholic, as I recall. Is that right?
Yeah, especially the second Klan. I mean, by the 1920s, the Klan is all about anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic. So
now the labor movement, though, is gaining power. You've got the rise of the penny press, and there's more newspaper coverage about the plight of the worker. Congress is starting to shift and make laws to protect the little guy here, right? So what's the labor organizers, right? What's their relationship with the church at this point? Are they independent of this? Are they...
That's what the book's all about. The book is all looking at how did ordinary working people who were in many cases Christian of one kind or another interact with the churches. And what I found is that they weren't, you know, there was this association in the minds of many respectable people between working class protests, so trade unions and such, and godlessness. That's not what you'll find at all in the United States. I mean, there's some of that in Europe, but here in the United States, what you find is working people who believe strongly that God is on their side and who are just absolutely furious. And in many cases, they feel betrayed by churches that have joined up in their minds or kind of in cahoots with big business. And so what you find time and again is working people challenging the churches on their own terms. So saying, you know, God, if you read your Bible, you know, it says that we should have a 6-day work week. And so you get, you know, campaigns to get Sunday off, and people go around and they say, do you read your Bible? This is what the Bible says. It says that we should have Sundays off. So they're using kind of the rhetoric and themes in the Bible and the Christian tradition to advance labor's cause.
And is there any joining of efforts here? Are there union leaders who are affiliated with the churches?
By the early 20th century, the churches are starting to reach out to labor. And part of the reason for that is they're very worried about the loss. There's a perceived crisis amongst both Protestants and Catholics. People get very nervous that they're losing the poor. The churches are losing the poor. And so they start to reach out to labor, and they start to bring laboring people in, consult them, survey them. So laboring people start to hold positions of leadership in the churches, and are asked, to come and preach even. I mean, the book begins actually with workers across Chicagoland standing in the pulpit on Sunday morning, the Sunday before Labor Day, 1910, preaching to congregations. So,
and was Chicago unique in any way? If you look at this movement in terms of the whole nation.
Yeah, Chicago is, I think, unique in the sense that it's really an epicenter of a lot of the trends that I'm tracing. It's an epicenter of working class mobilization worldwide. People are looking to what's going on in Chicago, and Haymarket and Pullman. These are kind of internationally
a lot of the books that
known.
are written about the labor movement
are based in Chicago for a reason. And in the same way, it's also a hub of religious innovation and activity. So I don't think Chicago is unique in the sense. I think if I had written this book about other places, I would have found similar developments. But Chicago is a particularly nice place to study because it's got such a rich history on these fronts.
And you're teaching in Northwest Indiana. Obviously. So do you see parallels today?
This past Labor Day, it's interesting. 115 congregations in Chicago had workers affiliated with the Chicago Federation of Labor or other labor organizations speaking to them in their worship services, Jewish congregations, Christian congregations. So certainly there's a continuous history of working people, religious organizations and labor organizations trying to work together. But I think, as we said at the beginning, that there are some important discontinuities in that, many of my colleagues in the field of American history have written these great books showing that Christianity, more often than not, in the last generation has been used to justify a kind of neoliberal corporate capitalism than it has been to challenge the same. So
interesting. And how do you see it now? Like this moment?
This moment. I think that as it stands right now, that the kind of social gospels that the workers in my book were preaching are quite marginal in our society today. They're not. You can find them. They're out there, but they're not what you're going to hear if you go to church in Valparaiso, Indiana, or many parts of this region or many parts of the country. I think you're going to hear a different kind of gospel, one that is much more comfortable with the kinds of inequality that we have today.
Well, that's interesting. And I guess we would probably see a lot more diversity in terms of the types of messages you're getting from the different churches and even from different people preaching in different churches, right? I think. Sure.
Oh yeah, there's certainly, depending on the church you go to, depending on the local context, you find a lot of different things. I mean, one of the things I find very interesting is that many of these churches, part of what my book is looking at is how did working people change the church's mind about labor? And one of the ways that you're able to see that is that in the early 20th century, denomination after denomination issues these official endorsements. Many of those are still on the books today, but the reality is that if you talk to the people in the pews, they don't know they're on the books.
I've run campaigns where we took the candidates around to the churches to get endorsements and talk about things. Okay, well, we're going to take a quick commercial break, and the Calumet Roundtable will be right back. Welcome back to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. My guest today is Dr. Heath Carter. Heath has written about something called the social gospel and the working class movements in America. Heath, I want to get to the scriptural side of this for a second.
Yeah.
I know in Acts of the Apostles, I think, it talks about the early Christians pooling all of their resources, their money and their food and everything, and they're all sharing. It's very Marxist, really, I think. You know? So how does the church manage to maintain an indifference towards the plight of workers and the disparity of the richest Americans versus the poorest Americans?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's always everybody has their canon within the canon, you know? People have their scriptures that they like to cite. Workers love to cite the 5th chapter of the book of James, where it begins, "Woe to you, O rich," and it goes on. It gets pretty intense, and you know, talk about the wages that you stole from the laborers working in your fields. I mean, laborers love to bring that one out. You know, they would talk about in the Gospels, Jesus says, "The laborer is worthy of his hire," these kinds of verses. But the church leaders had a whole other canon, right? I mean, they'd love to point out the fact that, you know, there were rich and poor in Jesus' time, and he certainly wasn't working to overthrow the social order in the ways that...
No, he actually goes out of his way to say that he's not trying to overthrow the social order. In fact, he says the poor will always be with you, right?
Yeah. So church leaders would point to that and say, look, you know, this Jesus that we all claim to follow wasn't about this kind of social change. So therein lied my view is, you know, that it doesn't actually end up getting worked out on the grounds of theology. There are competing theologies, and it really gets worked out. The churches change their mind, not because they are fully convinced that the workers have got the truth, but because they're susceptible to the fact that in the United States, religious organizations don't enjoy the support of the state. They're reliant on the people in the pews. And it appeared to many church leaders in the early 20th century that they were losing the people in the pews. And so they had to kind of get together and have some meetings in denominations and say, look, if we want to get these people back, what they're telling us is we've got to support unions. And it's no coincidence, I don't think, that denomination after denomination says. So at some level, the book is really about kind of power and politics within the church and the ways in which workers are, even as they're fighting for better wages, better working conditions, trying to get the state to recognize trade union movements, they're also embattled and throwing themselves into these fights within the churches and playing kind of these power and politics games within the churches in order to get the churches to recognize the value and merit of their particular vein of faith.
Well, it's a subject that's worth debating. It's been debated for a long time. I wonder how interesting this is, though, to you know, the average worker out there. What's the percentage of people in labor unions today? It's
very small.
Below 10%, right?
Yeah, in terms of private sector workers, it's just less than or right around 7%. You know, right after the Second World War, it was about a third of private sector workers were in unions. So it's a precipitous decline.
Quite a decline. And are you tracking the decline or rise of church attendance? Where are we at in the U.S. with that?
Yeah, the most recent Pew Forum Survey on religion in American life showed that right around, I think it's about 70% of the country identifies as Christian. I think that it's right around there. So that number is actually...
What percent is church going?
Yeah, well, these are all very contentious.
Who's there to hear those sermons, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, it's very, very contentious to try to dig down and figure out those kinds of numbers. The Pew numbers are for how you self-identify. And so many of my colleagues are interested in the fact that many people are increasingly self-identifying as a nun, N-O-N-E. You know, they're not religiously self-identifying. That's kind of a gross sector. But it remains the case that the percentage of people who self-identify or affiliate with Christian groups vastly outstrips the percentage of people who even express support for labor, let alone are part of a labor union. So there's a pretty significant disparity there in terms of...
Well, so what I'm getting at is, does it matter today if churches do or don't support labor movements? And are labor movements even going to be here much longer?
Yeah, those are big questions. Those are huge questions.
What do you think about that?
I think it does matter. I think that these arguments over the kind of moral status of organized labor, I think they do matter. I think that's what my colleagues in the field of 20th century U.S. history have shown quite decisively, is that we have now been able to recover these histories in the Cold War era and afterwards, as millions of Americans came to believe that free enterprise was a distinctively Christian way of doing business. And that matters, and I encounter that in my classroom. I mean, I talk to students, and they don't know about their denomination's pronouncements about the American Federation of Labor back in 1904, but they have a kind of gut sense that, the minimum wage, that's not a moral issue. That, look, it's just economics. The market is a set thing, and if you raise somebody's wage, that means some people are going to get laid off because that's the way the market works. And historians are going to say, well, the market is what we make it. We make the market.
Yes, Adam Smith sort of justifies that first position, though, right? Because he says the market, it will be what it will be, right? And he kind of absolves the Christian of any responsibility they have.
And the historians and the economists have been going back and forth ever since. I mean, I think historians want to say, look, you can't issue these kind of pronouncements about the market is this, the market is that. Markets are historically contingent. They depend on, they differ. We can show that they differ, and markets are in fact quite variable.
And they're very much influenced by government, and that's why we have an SEC and all kinds of rules to oversee that.
Exactly. So I don't know, but the question about whether unions are going to be around, my children, when they are out in the workforce, I mean, they'll be around. Public sector unions are, as you probably may know, also, they're higher membership numbers, but quite embattled in their own right in different states. They've been under assault in recent years. Labor's got probably its best growth sectors are in kind of the industries that can't go overseas. So manufacturing is kind of probably a lost cause, but healthcare, education, service, these are the industries where there's probably the greatest hope for some kind of revival. Last couple weeks ago, actually, the Archbishop of Chicago gave a speech to the Chicago Federation of Labor and came out very strongly against right to work, which was quite notable and interesting. And I think, if you get religious leaders around the country coming out with those kinds of statements, it could have a real impact on the kind of future of these movements. We live in a much more religiously diverse country than we did 100 plus years ago. But I still think, even in its kind of greater pluralism, that religious ideas about labor really matter.
Well, one place where this seems to matter is with the Tea Party movement. There's some debate about what issues they're going to settle on from time to time. But one of them seems to be abortion. And another one seems to be a desire for lower taxes and disinterest in raising minimum wage, things like that. So how did that happen? How does somebody, take a strong stand on one religious issue and then take a stand on an economic issue that's to most of us somewhat contrary? How did that happen? What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's part of this longer story that I was referring to earlier, where there's a kind of, I think it speaks to the success of neoliberalism, by which I mean, this idea that markets exist and they can't be or they shouldn't be messed with, kind of revival of laissez-faire.
Unless the bank's folding, and then we want to dump all the money we can into it to save the bank, right?
But I think, there's this idea that economics is somehow not under the purview of ethics, or economics is not somehow under the purview of, in Christian terms, the gospel. It's very interesting, you may know.
Which is the separation that Adam Smith made, essentially, right?
Bernie Sanders went to Liberty University a few weeks ago, and Sanders is a fascinating character in the sense that, I think Sanders, more than anyone else, is trying to take us back to the Gilded Age, by which I mean, he's really framing these core issues of economic inequality as moral issues. He'll say, these are the moral issues of our time. And so he went to Liberty University, which is a place that's really taken a stand on another set of moral issues, abortion and same-sex marriage and these kinds of things.
If he gets a nomination, everybody's going to be reading your book.
Hey, that might be true.
But anyway, go ahead.
But he goes to this place, and it's fascinating to see these kind of parallel rival discourses. I mean, I recommend people to go and watch that speech and watch the Q&A afterwards, because you can really see these rival discourses on display, and it doesn't appear like there's a lot of intersection, you know? There are certainly other Christians out there who would still say, look, these economic issues are moral issues. But I think that as it stands, the Tea Party and other kind of analogous organizations have been able to build momentum, because it's not taken for granted that these economic questions, economic inequality is a moral issue. I think that's something that Bernie and other people are having to really argue quite strenuously for.
Well, it's interesting that argument's coming from, not from the source that we would expect it to come from, I guess, is all.
Yeah.
So do you see this Tea Party movement kind of tearing itself apart over these issues? Or do you think that they're going to stay comfortable with that and be a force for a while here? What's your prediction?
Yeah, it's a good question. Historians are always wary about predictions.
Well, that's okay. I'm into rhetoric, so I can handle it. Yeah.
You know, I don't see that. I don't know about the Tea Party in particular, but I think that there will continue for some time to be a strong bulk of Americans, of American Christians who are going to continue to see free enterprise and, laissez-faire, neoliberal economics as the God's way. I don't see that going away. I think it's taken deep root in national culture and political culture. And I think those, like Bernie, like people in the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, these other groups have a lot of arguing to do, and I think especially a lot of work to do at the grassroots. Yeah. And I think that's really where a lot of this, it's one thing for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to make pronouncements and to make statements, but what's going on in Catholic parishes in Valparaiso and Gary and Hammond and the south side of Chicago? What do those people think, and what are they hearing, and how are they hearing these connections being made? I'm not convinced that in those local religious contexts that people are encountering the kinds of social gospels that my workers were preaching back in the late 19th century.
Well, and this is something that all of our viewers can check out for themselves by just seeing what the conversation is at the social hour after the sermon, right?
Absolutely.
Very good. That's all the time we have right now for our program. Thank you for joining me today for the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. Have a great day.